Today I'm here with Cleve Lightfoot. Cleve has spent 33 years in the mining industry. 25 years of those have been here in Chile, where he's led the teams of innovation technology for Tier 1 miners. Today we're going to hear from Cleve a little bit about his experience in the mining industry. Thank you for joining us, Cleve. Really appreciate it. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your history and your background and your experience.
Thanks for the invite, Cody, and really happy to have this opportunity to experience or share my experiences. Originally born in South Africa, I studied metallurgical engineering, initially worked in South Africa in the gold industry, and then went into the project world. Interestingly enough, I've always had a thread of technology implementation, certainly in those first years, initially on mine sites, but then through major projects. After South Africa, I went and worked in Ghana, then projects in Uzbekistan, working out of the UK, spent some time in Australia and Perth, working in the nickel industry, before coming to Chile to actually help Codelco get across the line with a JV with BHP to test bioleaching technology for copper concentrates. And then I chose to stay, and so that was, as you said, 25 years ago.
Wow.
With BHP, I was very fortunate that besides being sent around the world and experiencing different aspects of mining, I ended up spending a lot of time in innovation and technology over the last 25 years. And a lot of innovation and technology is about really truly understanding what the future requires, where we are today, where the gaps are, how to structure the problem in the right way so we can pursue it, and then finding ways of actually doing it, or solving or coming up with a set of solutions. And unlike in engineering, where normally there's one solution, really what we need to look at is generate options for the industry. Particularly when we're going into areas of unknown like decarbonisation, water. We're really looking at an industry which largely hasn't changed much over the last 100 years, certainly from the technology we use. Yes, the toys are bigger and a little bit more sophisticated, but they're still largely trucks, shovels, mills, flotation heaps and things like that. And we need to change that to be relevant in a future sustainable world.
Absolutely. And your experience a lot is from a Tier 1 miner's perspective, which is different than from being from a service provider. So I'm curious to know from your experience, what is driving the adoption of technology in the mining industry right now?
Well, the key thing which has changed over the last, I'd say even as close as 25 to 30 years, are the concepts around environment, sustainability and governance. So the community have developed a voice which, if we want to maintain our license to operate, has to be dealt with. So community is big. And you say, well, how does mining impact on community? Well, there's things like dust, there's tailing storage facilities which sit in many people's backyards. So the tech around that is, well, how can we not build traditional tailings storage facilities? How can we put dry material out there in a different form? How can we find other uses for tailings? How can we monitor tailings facilities so that people can actually understand what's happening in real time of what's sitting in their backyard, particularly in places like Chile, where we are a seismic country, and after every earthquake or tremor, what is the status of that tailing facility? I think after that, then decarbonisation is big. Decarbonisation means we need to be more efficient, but we also need to figure out how do we actually hack our concentrators, well, basically all our processes. So, how do we go from a diesel-driven truck and shovel operation to an all-electric? And that drives a whole lot of things: electric drive trucks, how you put in the infrastructure to actually provide that energy. Safety continues to be big. So, we've really seen anti-collision rollout. We've really seen, well, the next level after anti-collision is obviously autonomous, and autonomy has come a huge way, both in drills and in trucks. And so that's been a big win from a safety point of view. There's anti-fatigue. And then you get into productivity. And productivity is how can we get more out of what we've got, particularly out of our resource where the value actually lies. How we can do that with generations which are coming into mining which don't really want to sit on a mine site, where there has been an almost sort of unlearning of some of the experience with people retiring and more mine sites on and demanding more people. So this becomes a place ripe for sensors, advanced process control, and artificial intelligence.
And so from what I'm hearing from you is that this drive of technology isn't so much about the bottom dollar, it's about stakeholders, it's about the community, it's about the environment, it's about doing things in a better way.
At the end of the day, you need to do both, because the stakeholders, depending on what hat they're wearing, they want value. I think it's just the way we look at value. Value today is not just a dollar sign. It is quality of life, impact on life, sustainability. And ultimately what you need to look at is all of those things combined. So not only do I want something which, a decarbonized mine, for example, but it also needs to be sustainable financially. In other words, generate revenue.
Absolutely. And so right now what we've seen is a lot of different technology companies are moving in the whole world, but coming to Latin America, and they're trialing new technologies. And I wanted, from your perspective, what are some of the weaknesses that these companies need to understand that the mining companies, they might not have the skills or the tools in certain areas? Could you speak to maybe some of the things that they should know or understand when they're trialing new technologies?
I'd maybe take a step before that, Cody. At a higher level, to me, there's multiple actors, right? And if we look at the two principal actors, it will be the technology supplier or vendor and the operator. So the person on the ground actually producing is responsible for that sustainable production. Now, there exists an asymmetry of experience and knowledge between those two groups. So the very first thing a technology supplier needs to know is what value or what pain am I coming to solve? And is that amongst the top priorities of who I'm working with? Because we're already working in an industry which is full of risk. So the way the mining industry would look at it, certainly from the operator side, is, well, I'm adding more risk to a basket which is already full of risk. So the big thing is, well, I need to get confidence not just in the technology, but also the people who are custodians of that technology or owners of that technology, that I'm not adding risk, unknown risk to this basket already. But the first piece on how do you align and deal with that asymmetry means that there's a human piece which you need to do there, and an organizational piece. There needs to be conversations which can be quite iterative to make sure you're working on the right thing. If you don't get that right, everything else is just heartache. Once you've got that lined up, then I think it becomes a lot easier, but you need to make sure there's lots of things which line up there. The contract piece needs to capture the spirit of what you're trying to do. You need to be fairly generous around the timings, because if something's new, your technology might be well known, but you're working in an environment, and this is independent of whether you're in Chile or anywhere else, you're in a mine site environment which is different. And to be quite honest, the replication from one mine site to another mine site, the plug and play piece just doesn't exist. So each replication or scale is slightly different. And you need to be generous in time and expectations around that for that to happen. But that's not just from you as a supplier. It also needs to be reciprocated with your client. So the whole concept of how do you co-develop your test work, how you identify what your KPIs and things like that are, is absolutely critical, because if you don't get your expectations set up in the beginning, it's just going to lead to frustration later on.
And something you had mentioned is that within a mining company, you have operational staff, you have other staff that are part of, for example, innovation technology groups, and you have priorities of a head office or that come from abroad. And so how do we manage these different stakeholders? Because each one has something that they want or they expect. Would you have any advice as to how you can manage?
I would start off by saying that when I was in tier one miners, I was like, my clients were also on the production side because I was looking after technology and innovation.
Yeah.
So outsiders from the tech and supply space were experiencing things which I was also experiencing, which quite often they don't recognize. So I like to think I can speak from a certain amount of authority with that. If you don't have the site leadership on board on something, you're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah.
Because they are ultimately responsible for delivery of a product. You might have co-accountability because you, for example, putting in the technology, but your success is going to depend on them. Innovation teams and other corporate groups, you need to engage and ensure that they are on board. Because if they're not on board, they're going to add white noise to the relationship. And ultimately, to be successful, you're going to, and say if you've got a digital product, you're going to need a technology function or an IT function on board with you for it to be enabled. Because none of the things we're really dealing with are just owned by a single individual. There's a pot of multiple people. And that probably brings me to the element which, as an industry, we do really, really poorly, and that is change management. I think where the industry has done it well is in mine haulage, the automation of that. Yeah. Particularly in operations which have been going concerns, because they could not afford any hiccup in the changeover because of production. So there's been very strong change management around that. Ultimately, what we need to do is take that change management and move it into all the projects, independent of whether they're small or big, for them to have a better chance to go somewhere. And that change management is not just on the operator level. You need change management which is tiered for the different levels in the hierarchy. It needs to deal with the why. It needs to be able to give tools to the people. It needs to educate them if education is required to be able to operate, well, commission and operate afterwards. You need to have understandings around things like how are roles going to change. So for example, if you're rolling out, let's say, an artificial intelligence solution, someone which is now basically taking decisions for you, previously the operator would be taking those decisions. Now, first of all, you're going to get resistance from the operator because you're taking something away from him or her. But what you're really doing is that operator now needs to be a data controller or data owner, best said. And the supervision needs to become a data steward, because the quality of the decisions in artificial intelligence is dependent on the data.
Exactly.
But who writes those role descriptions? Who helps with that? Who explains to the operator or the supervisor that these things need to change, and the KPIs along with that change as well? So that needs to be part of the change management. And personally, just sticking on change management for a while, the client, the operations group need to own the change management. But the vendor needs to come there with the content to be able to supply to the change manager and say, this is the content which is required. This is the impact which is going to happen with your jobs. These are the tools which they're going to have to learn to use. These are the education pieces and the training pieces which are required. And it's really a question of having that good conversation around accountability of that right up front, so people are crystal clear on how that's going to play out.
I wanted to dig into that a little bit more. what exactly is change management? When we talk about change management from a vendor's perspective, how can they add to that conversation? How can they come in with inside their proposals a good change management program? And how can they really make sure that their technology is going to be used properly and used on an ongoing basis?
Well, just teasing out some of the last things I said. So they need to help the client with the why.
Yeah.
The training and education materials they understand their product.
Yeah.
So they need to provide that as content and then work with the supplier, or not the supplier, the actual client, so the two can then converge into a piece around training and a schedule of how you would actually train those people.
Sorry, I wanted to dig in. So you would actually recommend that they create like a schedule of training and getting the right people?
And you would supply the content.
Perfect, okay.
Okay. Obviously, the client puts the contextual stuff because it's their operation. A good example of this, for example, autonomous haulage.
Yeah.
There's about 400 hours per operator for training. Now you can't get a driver out and do 400 hours in a classroom. So there's some classroom, but most of it's on the job. And so you also need to look at balancing that and make recommendations. Excuse me. Tools, I think, is probably a bit easier because that normally goes accompanying the tech which you are going to roll out. You make recommendations around things like job descriptions, which will be able to support the client. The client obviously owns the roles and the role descriptions, but they need to understand what the impact's going to be, if there is at all. Being sort of continuous improvement problems. Some of those still exist today, which I and other colleagues worked on in the last 20, 25 years. So you have to ask yourself why they're recurring. And I think a lot of them are recurring for two reasons. One, I think the very manual operating system which we've got is unsustainable for those type of solutions. We need to re-platform into like a digital platform to actually start having sustainable solutions around that. And that's going to be vital if we want to become green mining and things like that in the future. And the other thing is because there hasn't been follow through for a certain amount of time by the supplier. Because you need to make sure that people truly understand it, they're using it correctly, it becomes sticky and it stays sticky.
And so we're seeing a lot of companies coming from Australia, Europe, Canada, North America. Even more particular, I've seen in the last probably 2 years, there's a lot more companies coming from California and from outside mining who are now bringing technologies to the industrial sectors. And so this part of change management is being able to speak with the operations team. It's about being able to work with them. And so in your mind, how important is, if you're going to enter the Chilean market, is to have like a local team that speaks Spanish? How big of, when you're choosing different suppliers or to provide something, how big of a deal is that they have those local?
I think it's absolutely critical. Because beyond language, there's also a cultural component of how you approach, and it's not just Chile or that. There's a great book called Culture Mapping, I think it is, where it actually shows how different cultures engage at different sort of levels, and then obviously when you start mixing cultures, how they can actually think they're speaking the same thing, but actually be speaking something totally different. So having people who can actually translate that and be able to land it. So one is on a national level, and then the other one is obviously being able to speak the language of operations. So I've been on a digital journey for probably about 14, 15 years now. Yeah. I'm certainly not a digital native. I'm still constantly exposed to new terms and things like that. The problem is that quite often if you use that jargon in front of like a digital type jargon in front of a mining operator, they're not going to understand anything. So being able to to translate what you're trying to do into simple language so people can really understand it, and understand what miners listen to, particularly value. How's this going to impact on you? What value is it going to create? What pain is it going to take away? And be very crystal clear around the business and the impact rather than the tech. And quite often we can get blindsided by the tech and get caught up in the technology to a level which just makes the other party's eyes roll.
Exactly. And so a lot of what we see is we're coming to Chile, we're going to hire people. Do you think it's important to have people that have worked on site and understand that operational culture, or do you think an outsider can come in and still work in the same?
I think you need a mix.
Yeah.